like the difference between me and someone who is really into engineering is that when they go to YouTube or they go to Twitter or they go to Facebook, what they see is topics related to engineering. And what I saw was topics related to video games. That ultimately their goal is to provide business value. And if they can, they will. But if they can't, that's not necessarily always their fault that they're inadequate. I think that we're rare in the tech space in that we actually do not have a product department at
All right. Welcome, everyone, to Bob's, the business of building software. First time at this subtitle. Let's see how it goes. The Full Stack Podcast, where we dive into building, buying, and selling great software. How was that? First
Great.
take. All right. My guest today is Christian Hubbard. Christian is currently a senior software engineer at Fashionphile. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
All right. So why don't we start with a bit about yourself, what Fashionphile is, and what you do for them?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Christian Hubbard, as you mentioned. I'm a senior software engineer at Fashionphile, and we are a luxury re-commerce business. So we specialize in authentication of luxury goods. Usually that means like Gucci and Louis Vuitton handbags is like the majority of stuff that we buy and sell. Also Chanel, Hermes, Birkin, stuff like that. Occasionally, we also do like belts, rings, shoes here and there, but the main focus is luxury handbags. And I focus specifically on the e-commerce side of things. I've worked on many parts of their application, from the checkout experience to the mobile application to the front end shop, which specializes in page performance and SEO. And I've learned a lot during my time there. I'm excited to talk about it a bit today.
All right. So the e-commerce side, like what is that built in? What are you guys using?
Sure.
What does that like tech stack look like? Yeah.
It's Next.js. We have a couple different small repositories, like one for our checkout, one for our shop, and one for our sell domains. So we have some subdomains split apart, and I think everything's hosted on AWS, but all the front end stuff is Next.js and TypeScript.
Yeah, so like all self-hosted Next.js stuff.
Self-hosted Next.js stuff through AWS.
Awesome. Yeah. Sweet. So this is an interesting question. So, you have this, like, I'm assuming as a software engineer, you got this Jira board of tickets, right? Things to get done. How are those things coming onto your plate? Like, is there like a process that you have like product that will get user feedback and throw that into that board and you guys will start working on things? Is there like another flow where there's other stakeholders kind of involved in those decisions?
There's many different stakeholders. We have a marketing department that's very vocal, and their opinion and feedback is very important. Our design and customer experience department is also very important. And then we have high-level executives that give a lot of feedback, and they're very involved in product decisions. And of course, their feedback is incredibly important too. So we regularly give product demos of the stuff that we're working on and iterate with feedback. But we are rare in the tech space in that we actually do not have a product department. We used to, and we just found, I won't speak for the executives there, but we don't anymore. And the way that tickets get created is through grooming sessions where senior and lead engineers talk with stakeholders and base work off of a agreed upon roadmap that the tech department higher ups, whether that's director of engineering or chief information officer, have already agreed to, committed to, and communicated outward of like, these are the things that we're going to be working on over the next quarters. And those are our large rocks and like boulders that we're trying to get done. And we really try to roadmap those at least 2 to 3 sprints in advance. Usually it's up to like 3 to 6. And then we take in smaller rocks as feedback from marketing and design departments as well. And then some small bug tickets as well. And we always leave probably 10% of our sprint capacity for bugs.
Nice. Interesting. I mean, I've heard this before actually with Whatnot. So like another startup out here in LA. They got pretty big. I'm pretty sure they hit unicorn status. But I think that when they were starting, they didn't have a product manager until they had like 40 engineers. So I'm actually curious what your take is, because you've, if I get this right, you were at Fashionphile before and after there was lots of like product folks. So in some cases, like I think like building software is kind of artisanal and more of a craft. So I'm curious, like, how is it like before and after?
I think product is really necessary when there's a strong divide between stakeholders and users. But our company is still founder led, and our founder is intimately acquainted with our users and what they want. So I think their perspective is that they are very aware of how their users feel, and that product spent a lot of time reinforcing opinions that they already had. And if you're not gaining sort of new information and they're not providing incredibly valuable insight for what you should do and when you should do it, I think a lot of companies have to make a difficult decision of examining how much they're spending on a department that goes to provide business value. And if they can, they will. But if they can't, that's not necessarily always their fault that they're inadequate or something. But at certain companies, maybe Whatnot is also founder led, and
Mhm.
they have a very keen sense of what they need to do to provide value for their users, and they just thought that product wasn't offering enough business value to justify the cost.
That makes sense. Yeah. I mean, I think that's kind of like that is the Silicon Valley, way of operating nowadays, right? It's extremely founder led. Um, and they, that's like the top down. It almost feels kind of like a artisanal craft, even at like the scale of an Apple or a Meta, right? I mean, you see like Zuck is super hands on with the direction of every big initiative that they're doing now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's so interesting, yeah. So it's kind of using product in a way. It's like what bring data in and kind of make the case for like let's say the executive's decision, and without that kind of infrastructure, maybe it gets a little more thrashy on the day to day as a developer. Is that kind of the takeaway?
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. I think there's
Yeah.
definitely some drawbacks, and the process in general is maybe a little bit less smooth without product. But when interest rates are high and you have to make decisions on how lean your company can be if you can't spare developers, I think a lot of companies may choose to allow a bit of thrashiness, as
Mm-hmm.
long as they have an iterative process anyway, that they know they're going to get to the same place. It may be a little bit bumpier, and as long as everybody's on board, that's the decision.
Gotcha. Okay, so you got these big rocks. You kind of figured out what the sprints are going to look like.
Yep.
Walk me through maybe like not necessarily like a bigger project, but maybe something that does get finished in about like a sprint's time, like 2 weeks. Um, how does that look like? Right, that like walk me through that ticket going from like to do to completed.
Yeah, I think if it's getting done in one sprint, usually as a front end developer, or at least front end focused developer, usually that means the back end services are already implemented. So we're able to hit an API and get a response, and we know what we're building around. So we have some basic data coming back from an API. In one sprint, it's just a matter of building whatever component needs to ingest that data, and then offer users the ability to either like maybe toggle how behavior is going to happen on the front end, or maybe it's like a form they fill out and then submit to an API, and that changes something on the front end. And the goal is to get that done before the end of the sprint, so that we have plenty of time to get that in front of stakeholders, and that they can play with it, they can sit on it, they can meditate, and give some feedback. Then we can make some last minute iterations before we go through a hopefully rigorous QA process and deploy out to users.
Mm-hmm. So how are you setting the? So I'm assuming like you get the ticket in, you read the specs, you go and
Yep.
code it up, right? And then you get the PR going. How do you send that over to stakeholders? Are you doing like preview environments? Is that in the workflow at all?
Yeah, so we do have preview environments in our workflow. We use AWS Amplify to set
Mm-hmm.
up a couple small preview environments that is, a couple different staging like front ends. And after we set a PR and we have code review on it, we can push it to an Amplify environment and get some feedback from a stakeholder while we are QA testing that as well.
Mm-hmm. And where does that ever break? Like, is that as like a slowdown? Like, are you waiting for environments? I mean, I've used Amplify before, and it does some unpredictable things sometimes. Like, or I mean, or even just like scaffolding a new environment. I know just like AWS moves at a glacial pace.
It was difficult to get set up at first, but I think once you have CI/CD set up and you can just sort of push to the GitHub branch that is set to track to an Amplify environment, usually it's pretty smooth. Occasionally it won't build for some reasons. Sometimes it's linting related, sometimes it's AWS related, and you have to go into the AWS console to see why it seemed like it was fine in GitHub but isn't building in AWS for some reason. But usually it's a matter of like a missing environmental variable, or one environmental variable was set up to inherit from a group, and all these AWS instances are like set as a group, and maybe the specific feature that we're testing needs to have a specific value set there, and that's why the
Mm,
feature that we're trying to demo isn't showing up in our environment. But it is rare for them to like go down and be unaccessible. I think
mm,
the most trouble that we have there is around URLs. And because specifically we break our website into smaller subdomains, I think the biggest issue we have is navigating across those subdomains and maintaining like a solid user experience in case there's a feature that spans all the way from the shopping experience to the checkout experience. We have it set up so we have QA amplifier environments for our shopping experience and for our checkout experience, and we've set some environment variables so that the links you click will keep you in the same um, sort of amplify environment. We have 5 different staging environments. So if you're on amplify 4 for our shop, it'll take you to amplify 4 for checkout. We just have to make sure that those are kept, in sync, and that the same feature is sort of in the same place for both. And sometimes things get misplaced, but we're able to sort it out. And I think
mm,
that's the trade-off you make, in the same sense that, you let go of product and sometimes things are a bit thrashy here and there.
mm.
If you don't pay a premium for, high tier hosting services that sort of do everything for you, sometimes things get misplaced and it can be a bit thrashy. But
Yeah.
as long as you keep your head on a swivel and, fix it whenever problems occur, um, for the most part, it's fine.
Yeah. So I guess that's an interesting kind of point to click into also is like the tooling, right? So even for like your day-to-day coding, like do you think that the framework decision had a lot of like impact on how quickly you move, or is it just more like the team and everyone is pretty familiar with TypeScript or JavaScript or whatever you guys are using, and it's just like the flywheel is already set, like we're able to move quick just because everyone has general familiarity.
Great question. I think it depends. The frameworks were decided long before we were moving fast, and it was definitely slow at first. TypeScript is one of those things where if you aren't intimately familiar with it, it can take a while to get used to, especially as you're setting it up and having to deal with like TypeScript configs. But if it's already been set up by someone who knows TypeScript pretty well, it can be a real blessing. Like it's great to have an object that you need a property from and just like enter the dot and see everything available there with IntelliSense. That can
Mm.
really speed up the workflow. But when it's misconfigured, it can be a confusing nightmare of TypeScript error messages that are sometimes not super clear.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Okay, so that you write the code, you get it into a staging environment, green flags from all the stakeholders. It goes into
Hopefully.
QA. Yeah, hopefully it goes into QA. And again, right, check marks all the way through. I'm assuming they'll just kind of like circle back with what the specs were and just like do an A/B check. Like, okay, this does the thing that we wanted it to do. It goes out into production. Once it goes into production, is there anything that happens afterwards? Right, like it's on fashionfile.com. As far as like analytics go, like success, right? Hey, did this feature actually do the thing we wanted to do? Do you or the team like do that type of analysis? Is that in the like
That's
software
not something
development
that I
cycle?
or the team does. I think most metrics are like downstream of the one important metric, which is value provided to customers. Hard to
Mm-hmm.
measure, but top line revenue, somewhat
Easy.
correlation
Yeah.
to value provided to customers.
Yeah.
So we don't have like really microscopic data on which buttons, which of these 2 buttons drive conversions a bit more to our checkout process. But we do monitor like number of checkouts per day and general revenue on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And we also have Sentry and Datadog set up, and whenever we do a release, we keep a close eye on both Datadog to understand our latency levels and
Mm.
Sentry to notice if we have any new errors coming from the release that we just pushed, or an increase in any existing error that maybe is non-emergency but something we know we need to take care of at some point. As long as it isn't spiking surprisingly after the latest release, um, we're good.
Nice. Okay, so you do have like a Datadog or Sentry set up just to understand the world after, right? Okay.
Yeah, but it's usually just making sure that nothing bad has happened, more so than understanding how users are interacting on our site. We also have a data team, and we use Segment to track our data analytics. But I don't know if the features that we're pushing out are strongly driven by what those metrics are.
Mm.
Like if we try to add a new feature to boost SEO performance, it's not like we will judge the feature as a failure if it didn't boost it by the number of points that we're expecting. We just know that SEO is a long journey, and anything you can do to help helps. So
Hmm.
we just try to do what we can when we can, and any boost we see, we think is positive.
It's actually interesting. There's that, like, I think it's a Bezos thing where he talks about like one-way doors versus two-way doors. Like
Yep.
there's certain decisions that you can't walk back. But there are like, and otherwise, like most cases, things are two-way doors where you can kind of go in and out of them depending on like, you know, what the environment is.
Yeah.
Has the team ever walked back a particular feature? Or you're like, oh yeah, this is definitely not the one. Let's get rid of this. Let's revert this change. Has that ever happened?
That's a great question. We've definitely reverted things, but I don't know if it's usually um, because it's not behaving as we expect to, more so than, there's some user focused metric that didn't go well. There's been a couple times where we think like, oh, hopefully this API can handle the amount of traffic that this new feature would push to it. And we see in Datadog our latency spike up for every X number of requests. And we like to play it very safe. So if we see any sort of like negative metrics in Datadog or Sentry, we try to turn the feature off and just sort of like analyze, see like, okay, if this were to happen at our absolute peak traffic, what's the worst case scenario, and do we have any better options? So there's been small cases where like, yeah, we've pushed out a feature and maybe we weren't prepared for the level of traffic and we need to reassess, but it hasn't been any sort of nightmare scenarios.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So do you typically release things with feature flags? So even though you have this kind of process where you got stakeholders in there, you got QA. I'm also assuming you're doing code reviews as well, but
Yep.
everything kind of ships with a feature flag, so you can just configure this on the fly.
Yeah, it depends on what you call a feature flag, but everything does have a
Okay.
feature flag. I wish that we would use some sort of more intricate system of feature flag. We did use like Optimizely full stack
Yeah.
for a little bit, and I really like the way that gave you control over like ramping up how many users saw a particular feature. But sort of as we talked about the product department, it was a little expensive, and we thought
Mhm.
that the amount of control it gave us compared to just using something like an environment variable. Um, you know, we do enough deploys where we can just create a new environment variable and add our code behind that and toggle the features, whether it's on or off based off of an environment variable. And so when we have push stuff out and we need to turn it off, we just change the environment variable and our secrets manager and just,
Mhm.
redeploy in Jenkins. And
Redeploy it.
yeah,
Yeah. Nice. Awesome, man. Cool. I kind of want to dig into just like how you got into tech in the first place. I think that'd be a cool place to do some discovery. So
for
yeah, I
sure.
mean, what was your story? What were you doing before? Was this like something that you always knew you were doing, or you're coding since you were 12?
Definitely not coding since I was 12, unless you count doing MySpace layouts.
That's coding, dude. That 100%.
Hey, if you say so, I had a sick Naruto layout in MySpace way back when.
Oh, nice.
But yeah, I think learning, just growing up on the internet, like inspecting pages, poking around, seeing what's going on, had a generally like good sense for the web and how things
Hmm.
worked. In college, I took a course I was actually a design major in college,
Okay.
and we did have one course on web design where I sort of like built my own sort of personal website. We use Adobe Dreamweaver, and there's
Oh
very,
yeah.
very basic
Nice.
JavaScript involved. And I was actually also like a freelance photographer and videographer for weddings back when I was in college. And I built myself a portfolio website using like WordPress and quickly realized like, hey, other people need this too. And this was back when Squarespace was really in its infancy and
Hmm.
not a lot of people knew about it. So I built some WordPress sites and some Squarespace sites for some other friends that wanted help setting up photography portfolios. Um, but that was the extent of my web development journey at the time. I did have one friend who graduated college a little early, and he got a job right out of college at Microsoft, and he was making good money. And as a Bachelor of Arts with a design degree, I was definitely hurting in the full-time job department for a little bit post college. And I looked into doing web development boot camps then. But at the time, most of web development was still Laravel. It was WordPress. It was this model view controller system. And for some reason, like it just never really clicked. Like setting up a domain, installing WordPress, and like editing layouts as if it was MySpace, that made sense to some level. But the more basic mental model of programming and how Laravel or something like that worked just
Mhm.
kind of went over my head at the time, and I was interested in other things. So I moved out to LA, worked in the film industry for a while, tough industry, eventually pivoted into social media management because it allowed me to use my design skills, my photography skills, and a little bit of writing, and be in the arenas that I wanted to be in, which was specifically like video games and esports at the time. But after a couple of years doing that, I just felt like I wanted a little bit more of a challenge, a little bit more of what I felt like was a grown-up job, and decided to actually quit the job that I had at the time and try to teach myself how to code. I went backpacking through Europe and took an online boot camp on data visualization, learned Python and SQL as I was doing that, and came back to LA right before the start of COVID, looking for analyst jobs. But the problem with data visualization, which was, I thought that was a better pivot going from social media management because I had a lot of data analysis involved in the social media management side of things. But the problem is that they really are degree focused for business analysis and data science type roles. And after talking with that same friend who had had a job at Microsoft, he had actually moved around a bit in the tech industry since then. But I talked about the skills I had, and he was just really reassuring that, like, hey, you can easily get a job in JavaScript. It won't be too much more for you to learn since you already have skills in Python. You've previously done, some web dev stuff, and you have a basic knowledge of like divs, containers, header, footer, stuff like that. So I looked for roles and really just didn't know where to get started and decided to enroll in a boot camp. So I did a boot camp, and my timing on that was actually fantastic because I enrolled right before the world shut down for COVID. And it turns out everybody was stuck inside anyway. And the job market was completely frozen and no one was hiring. So I got really fortunate on timing of like, all right, well, there's nothing better to do. And I just threw my entire person into learning as much as I could about JavaScript. And at this point in time, this would have been in early 2020. At that point, React had taken over. So the paradigm of front end web development had totally shifted from large PHP monoliths to component based atomic design patterns, and React was everywhere. And for some reason, the functional components and atomic design of React just made so much more sense as far as a mental model in my brain. And I could really understand, like, oh, I get it. I understand how Facebook and Twitter is sort of built like inside out, if that makes sense, from a component pattern. And yeah, I just really enjoyed studying that. Was in the job market for a little bit after that boot camp and found a role here at Fashion File, and I've been loving it ever since.
Super interesting. So, I mean, actually, you had a lot of exposure to like tech and software for a while, right? Like with Squarespace early on,
Yeah.
and you did like multiple boot camps, right? So you did one in like data analysis and visualization. Was that what it was?
It's tough to call it a boot camp. It was more of like an online, go
Okay,
at your own pace training course. I got some certifications that look nice on LinkedIn, but
nice.
ultimately it was like reading an article, copy the Python that
Yeah,
was, exactly written there, and it works exactly how they tell you it's going to work,
yeah.
but wasn't as much of a trial by fire as an actual boot camp was.
Okay, yeah. And then you actually did the boot camp, and then
Yep.
how long until like walk me through like that process of getting a job? I think this is also super topical because the industry is kind of going through like another maybe the .com post bubble era. So
Yeah.
how long did it take you to find the job? What were some things that you did um, to get that to get this first role here?
Okay, so the program itself was around a 12-week program, if I remember correctly. And I think I had finished it in either the first week of June or the first week of July. I'm pretty sure it was like first or second week of June. And I had gotten the offer from Fashion File middle of August. So it really didn't take a long time, but the interest rates were incredibly low then because it was post COVID and
Yeah.
everyone was hiring like crazy. So again, I was incredibly fortunate on timing because I was really on the front end of this wave of new engineers getting jobs. Um, as far as what you need to do to get hired, I think your resume is incredibly important. I think the breadth of your study is pretty important, like understanding a lot of different small parts of how the web works and having like a really good mental model of like how these complex technologies tie together is really important. Because I had a strong experience in social media, one thing I really tried to do to hack my brain was I figured like what I need to do between me and someone who is really into engineering is that when they go to YouTube or they go to Twitter or they go to Facebook, what they see is topics related to engineering. And what I saw was topics related to video games. What I needed to do was like retrain the algorithms that I was using every day to teach them like, hey, I need you to show me productive things. So I went in and unsubscribed from probably half of the accounts that I followed on Twitter and YouTube and subscribed to all just anything that was related to programming. And I was watching and consuming anything related to programming, a lot of stuff I didn't even understand. But it gave me a good a good model and a good language to understand like culturally like what was happening in the programming space so that when I interviewed with people, I knew topics that they were asking about or they were interested in. I knew like pop culture within programming if it were. And the last thing I'll say that anyone who looking for a job needs to do, like you just have to code every single day. I remember after I graduated the boot camp, there was a couple days where I was sort of like, applying for jobs and just kind of sitting around. And I realized that I needed to do what I was hoping someone would hire me for. And like what an engineer does at a job every day is that they open up VS Code and they code. So if you are looking for a job in engineering every single day, you need to open up VS Code and you need to code something, not just grind algorithms, which is very important and something that you should put as like a daily practice if you're looking for work. But you still need to open up VS Code and be pushing code to GitHub every single day. You need to be someone who is coding.
Yeah. Yeah, that's all really good advice. I mean, it's essentially like interviews. It's you just have to you're getting a chance to prove that you can code. And if you can code, then it should be theoretically like pretty straightforward. But that's where I think it gets kind of tricky, right? Is because like it takes a lot of reps. But it's also like what you were describing is basically like how you should be learning languages, right? Like just full immersion
Immersion,
into the culture, right?
completely.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't even think about like unsubscribing and like unfollowing social feeds. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's some great influencers now, and people nowadays have it so much better than I did back then. I think it was hard for me to find programmers who are putting out consistent, high quality content. Not incredibly hard. Like there are some, great YouTubers that I'm thankful for at the time, but nowadays with people like the Primogen, Theo,
Yeah,
Ben Awad, I mean, there's just so much good content being produced on somewhere like YouTube that you can learn so much. I,
yeah.
I also want to add one last thing. In the boot camp, there wasn't a lot of trying not to say anything negative here, but there wasn't a lot of direct teaching, but it was more of like, teaching us how to fish. It was teaching us how to go find the information and teaching us how to self learn, which is one of the most important skills as an engineer. And throughout this process and throughout like working with others, I think the most important skill that I learned is transitioning the way that you think about problems. And when someone is a software engineer instead of just like a programmer, the engineer part of their brain needs to be a systems thinker. So when you're thinking about how to get a job, your job is to design a system that would get you a job and then just follow that system. So set up a system of like, oh, I will code from this time every day. I will apply to these jobs every day. And if you're wondering like what you should do, I would say like, well, what system do you have in place to ensure your success? And like what systems can you rely on? And just like start thinking about problems as systems problems. And how can you engineer a system or an environment that will get you closer to the outcome that you're looking for?
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. I mean, it's what I have done personally also. Um, yeah, I mean, like you set up systems, you set up funnels, it's and you just like do the steps. So I remember getting my what's an interesting example because I have kind of different stories for every one of my jobs. But I'll do one like after college. I basically had a system where I was reaching out to all the folks that I knew in college. I was in a frat, so all my
So you know a
frat
lot of
buddies,
people.
yeah, lots of people, lots of friends, and then just that's one like lead generation source. The other lead generation source obviously was like just pumping resumes.
Yeah.
The other was like career fairs. So this is all my top of funnel. And then I was getting good traction getting into interviews, and then I was failing the interviews. So it's time to do some leak coding, get that side of my skill brushed up. And then that took a bit of work because I was also doing school full time.
Yeah.
But I mean, the system worked. I mean, at that time, those were the steps, and it led to like a few offers. So that was like exactly how I had set it up. And I've been chatting with a lot of like younger folks who are like in the similar space where they're like just about to graduate with a CS degree, and they're hearing all this stuff about how the job market is, right? And I also go to like I forgot who this was, but it's I was a co-founder of a startup, and I think it was in the startup advice space where if your business is going well, you pat yourself and your team on the back. If it's going poorly and you're in the board meetings, you got to blame the macro. It's not me. It's interest rates are crazy. Nobody wants to whatever. I think a lot of it is like for jobs also potentially, where it's like ultimately you have to get one job. You're one person. You need one job.
Right.
There's definitely one programming job in this economy somewhere. It may not be at Meta or at Microsoft, but it's out there.
Yeah, but there
Um,
are jobs.
yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah,
think your perspective on what you're able to get, maybe there's not a lot of jobs available at Meta right now, but there are definitely jobs out there, and it's just a matter of like being hungry and making sure you're applying to those. And
yeah.
I think that the comment about when things are good, pat yourself on the back, and when it's bad, blame the macro. While it is all too common for maybe leaders in the VC space, I do think it's also like really valuable advice for people who get really just emotionally invested in the job search process, that to remember like it's a system, and that you should remember the positives when things are going well, and congratulate yourself and really celebrate your own successes and your team's successes and people supporting you, and be grateful. But at the same time, when you don't get that job at Meta or somebody else does, don't blame yourself, and don't say like it's not your fault. Like there are things you can do better, but remind yourself that there's other influences here. There are macroeconomic trends that influence things, and it's not like because you're an imposter or a bad coder or a bad leader or a bad founder is the reason things are going poorly. There's other influences. So, stay
Yeah,
positive and focus on what you can control.
yeah. But if it doesn't work, you just got to go to Reddit r/CS career questions,
Yeah, absolutely.
and
They
then
know
just like
everything.
vent. You got to vent there. I mean, I've seen it across like my sister's in law, and it's the same dynamic. They just vent all their frustrations and negativity on Reddit. It's a great place to be.
I would say that try to, if you are actually looking for a job, minimizing the amount of time you spend
Yeah,
on Reddit is probably some good
that's
advice.
that's actually the real advice. Is just as little time as possible on Reddit.
Yeah, or blind. There's really not a lot of helpful
Yeah,
information there, in my opinion. You'll learn a lot of gossip from inside certain companies, but just
yeah.
focus on what you can do to get better every day.
Pretty low alpha on those forums.
Yeah.
All right, man. Christian, it was good chatting. Where can folks find you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at, I think it's an underscore like YXGen4, or on YouTube, same place. I think no underscore there, but yeah, come give me a follow, say hello, let me know how you're doing.
All right. This was the first episode. I think that's it. We'll wrap it there. Till
Yeah,
next
sounds
time.
great. Thanks so
All
much for
right.
having me.
Yeah.